So one of the classic questions everybody's wanted to know for at least 100 years is, what explains evolutionarily why our brains get bigger, and what mechanisms, genetically and otherwise, made it happen? You work on that.
I do. It's a big problem, but it's clearly one that's very close to who we think of. I mean, when we think of what we are as human beings, the cognitive capabilities, those are the ones we think of. Creativity, our language.
We can talk with each other.
We can talk
it's
with each other.
It's such a miracle.
It's and we don't even think about it. And this has happened really just in the last couple million years of human evolution.
Which is an eye blink.
It's an eye blink evolutionarily, yeah.
So we must have been prepared by accident or something to go down that path. But what do you think it was that happened that created a selection force for bigger brains?
It seems as though it was a shift in the way in which we had to acquire food. So our deep ancestors lived in an environment that was probably fairly constant, where individuals foraged for their own food and didn't have to hunt or forage cooperatively. But as the climate in East Africa changed 2 or 3 million years ago, we were forced out into drier habitats where the only food sources required collaboration, effectively, required inventiveness to exploit. And so there would have been a change culturally, a change in individual behavior, but also a change in social behavior.
So this is figuring out that you can hunt together, or figuring out that you can dig a certain kind of tubers? What kind of things are we talking about?
Absolutely, those and others. The animals available would have been too big to hunt individually. So a zebra or a warthog or something like that would have also been helpful to be able to create some kind of a tool to help you hunt them.
When did spears first come in?
Spears come in not long after. Well, spears maybe a bit later, but stone tools with sharp edges come in around the time brain size starts to increase.
So about 2 million years ago?
About 2 million years ago, we enter what's called the Paleolithic, and initially those tools were probably used for butchery. So crack open bones, strip meat off bones. But it wouldn't have taken long to figure out.
So if you were clever enough to make a sharper stone, you could get more meat off your bones, you would eat better, you would be able to have more babies, and those individuals would pass on their genes more.
That's the idea, yeah.
Fascinating. Mm-hmm. Huh. So let's go on to talk about brains are quite expensive.
Brains are very expensive.
Are human brains more expensive per cubic centimeter than chimpanzee brains?
Probably not a lot more. They may be a little bit more expensive because there's been some tweaking with the way our brain cells work, but in general, all brains are expensive. And
how much more expensive?
They're almost 10 times more expensive than most of the rest. Almost 10 times.
Compared to muscles?
Compared to most of the rest of your body.
So this is just like a big light bulb that's radiating heat.
Yep, it is indeed, and that's why you feel cold. That's why you wear a hat when you go out. Your mom tells you when you go outside in the winter, make sure you wear a hat. That's because you lose half your heat through your head.
Wow. So what's going on here in terms of why it should be so expensive? What has to happen in the brain to spend all that energy?
Well, it's the way nerve cells work. They're poised for action. So they're constantly quivering, waiting for the signal. And when they get it, they fire, and then they have to reestablish that poise. So the only time
they basically have to pump potassium?
They're pumping potassium out of the cell, and they're keeping it in a very imbalanced state. And that's costly because the constantly pumping because the potassium is trying to sneak back in again.
It's like running the pumps in Arizona to keep the irrigation canals working.
Absolutely. Yep.
So you got to keep it going all the
time.
You
got to keep it going. And so even when you're resting, your brain's not resting.
And these nerve cells also, even though they're often long and skinny, have huge surface areas?
They have huge surface areas, and you've got to keep the potassium out over the whole cell, or it's not going to fire properly.
So a lot of energy goes into making brains that work.
Yep.
What are the implications for how selection has shaped brains and the rest of us?
Well, I think it raises, for a start, the question is, why would you make a bigger brain unless you had a really good reason to? Now, we think we know what the answer to that is. Our brains are great. They let us do things like have conversations and compose music and play video games and all the other things that are fun in life. But that comes at a cost. And so we have to ask ourselves, there were no video games on the savannah, but there probably was language. And the genesis of language.
And singing and dancing. And
cohesion of society, well, maybe planning hunts, maybe consolidating those social groups. That was probably why we began to really use a very rich language for communication.
So Robin Dunbar has talked about social groups being a certain size, and as they get bigger, you better be smart socially in order to cope. Does that make sense to you? Sure,
it makes sense. We all know that there are people who just seem to get along with everybody. and everybody likes them, and they tend to do well. And then there are the people who are maybe a little awkward, a little bit antisocial, and they don't always do as well. And so there's definitely a value to being able to work smoothly socially that was probably quite important in our evolutionary history.
Right.